at times. That's not, yeah. Yeah, I would, Roger will bring you one up. It's good to have everybody out this evening. Um, this is our second week of our summer series. We have Dale Pollard from the Farley congregation with us tonight. His lesson will be on is to live as Christ, to die as gain, out of the book of Philippians. Hope everyone opens up your Bible and follows along to that message. I'm sure you'll enjoy the message he will bring to us and be very beneficial. Got just a few announcements. I know we've got several on the sick, several traveling, some deaths in families, and I know Tommy and Kathy have traveled. I think that funeral was going to be tomorrow, I think. Gracie, his sister, up in Indiana. So keep them in the prayers, their travels. Also, Dawn, I talked to Keeney earlier today. Dawn made it through her jaw surgery well. A lot of pain, as we expected. So please keep her in the prayers also. I'm sure there's others. We don't do a whole lot of announcing of things on Wednesday nights. Is there any other sick or anybody that we need to mention tonight? All right. One other announcement. We're going to go ahead and start announcing on the 27th of this month. We're going to have Joey Treat, one of our missionaries, that is going to come and speak to us Sunday morning and give us a lesson and a report. We will also have a potluck meal or fellowship meal afterwards, so mark that on your calendar and be planning for that. That's June 27th. That's probably not already printed on the calendar, so you may want to write that down. So, all right. That's all I've got. Our invitation song, if you'd like to be turning that, will be 435. Dale will be leading the song services after Neil's lesson, and everybody can be ready for that. We'll start now. Chris will start us off with opening prayer, and then we'll get right into the service.
Would you pray with me, please? Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we come to Thee at this time. Lord, we thank You for the rain that we've had recently. Thank You for the blessings of that. Lord, we ask this morning, or this tonight here, that You would be with Tommy and Kathy as they travel. Be with them and comfort them and help them to make it home safely to us. Lord, we ask at this time that You would be with Dawn away also, as she just went through surgery. Help her to have a quick and speedy recovery process and get back to her normal place of health as soon as possible. Lord, we ask tonight that You would be with Neil as he brings us our lesson. Lord, help us to open our Bibles and follow along and study these things that he puts before us, and find these things to be true. Help us to apply them to our lives. Lord, be with us through the remainder of this service. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Everybody hear me okay? No? Technology, tell you.
How about now? Good? Woo. All right. For those of you that know my dad, Neil, I hate to disappoint. I'm Dale, his son. Oh, you're good. I was actually like, do I roll with this? Like, should I just just pretend that I'm my dad the whole time? But yes, I know all of the Bible. I have the whole thing memorized. I'm not there yet, but I am a student in training, I guess, technically still a rookie. So there's some times in the Bible where you see the human side of Jesus, obviously, and there are times when you see the supernatural side of Jesus when he's doing his miracles. And there are those moments that stand out to us when he's acting human, or when we can relate to him a little bit more. And events like the garden, when we see him crying and we see him stressed out about the events that are about to take place, and we see that human side of Jesus. And then there's that supernatural side of him. And I think the best book to go in the New Testament, probably also the most action-packed book in the Bible, is the book of Mark. And so Mark's goal throughout the whole book is to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. And so how he decides he's going to do this is he runs through event after event after event, proving that Jesus is the Son of God because of how powerful he is. And so he covers all of the major areas. He says Jesus is God because he has power over the natural world. And so we see Jesus walking on the water. And then he says Jesus is God because, look, he has power over the supernatural world. And he starts casting out demons. And he says Jesus is God because, look, he has power over sickness. And we see him curing all kinds of different diseases. And we see that he has power over everything, over the weather, over this entire world, over the spiritual world. But then there are some times where he shows that human side in more subtle ways. And a great place to see that is in Matthew chapter 16. Which is a very interesting list of events. And we're going to get to Philippians, I promise. I know that's my topic. I didn't forget. But in Matthew chapter 16, it opens up. Jesus is teaching, and he's making the most of his time, the most of his ministry on earth. And you have what I kind of picture the villain from Aladdin with the black cloak and like the turban and everything. You have the scribes and the Pharisees. They're standing on the outskirts as Jesus is teaching. And they're watching, and finally it's time for them to make their move. And so they approach Jesus and they say, "Show us a sign from heaven." And so what they're trying to get Jesus to do is to prove that he is God by controlling something that they considered that can only be controlled by God: the weather, the sky. Bring a tornado, make an earthquake, make it rain, make it stop raining. Like Elijah did in the Old Testament. They were very familiar with all of those events. And Jesus doesn't do it. And so you see this human side of Jesus because a lot of us humans, and I'll speak for the male population, sometimes that your ego can get put to the test here. You have someone coming up to you and saying, "Prove that you're God. Prove that you're God by showing us a sign from heaven." And if we were in that position, a lot of us, especially guys, I would say, if we were in that position, you're like, fine. You want me to prove that I'm God, and then do something like what happened in the Old Testament with in Numbers chapter 11, I believe, when God opens up the ground, swallows up everybody there, or do something outrageous like that would prove beyond shadow of a doubt that you are God, but he doesn't. And he turns and he walks away, and he goes over to his disciples right after this, and then he performs a miracle. He ends up feeding everybody that's there listening to him teach once again. But then we move to the section in Matthew chapter 16, which is probably the most well-known part of this chapter. It's when Peter is professing Jesus to be the Christ. And if you look down in Matthew chapter 16, you'll see that they approach this area called Caesarea Philippi. And this is down in verse 13. They come to the district of Caesarea Philippi. And this is the church that Paul ends up writing to later, this congregation there at Philippi. Now, this area, by the time that Paul is writing to the Philippians, is basically a retirement community of Roman soldiers. They've lived their entire life in service to Caesar. They're probably battle-hardened, but it was also a very pagan place. So there's these idols and these statues and all of these different gods all over the place. And so what's so incredible about this confession that Peter makes is that in the midst of all of these statues and all of these things that are around him of these pagan gods, all these Roman gods, he's able to then shift his focus from all of those surroundings and then look at Jesus and say, "You're the Christ." And I don't think he fully understood what he said when he said that, but it is still very incredible to see the faith that it took. And of course, Peter's the guy that's like, "If you're Jesus, let me walk on the water too." And he just gets out of the boat, and that's kind of his personality. But when you get to this area, we have to keep in mind as we approach the book of Philippians that this is where they're at. And so when we see that Paul is kind of coming down hard on two women in the congregation, which, by the way, the book of Philippians is a thank you note, which puts all of my thank you notes to shame. I don't know how many thank you notes you've written that are 4 chapters long, and they're just very that detailed. But it's a thank you note. It's written, Paul and Timothy are writing from a Roman prison, and they're thanking this church at Philippi for some money that they gave for their mission work. And so Paul is writing this letter to the Philippians, and then in the letter, he ends up calling out, in chapter 4, we see that he ends up calling out 2 women in the congregation. keep in mind, this is that thank you letter. And so the tradition was they would stand up in front of the congregation when they received a letter. And in front of the entire congregation at Philippi, this guy would get up and he would open up the letter and he would begin reading all the way down. And at the very end, I don't know if Euodia and Syntyche were not paying attention. Maybe they're thinking about lunch or whatever. And then they hear their name brought up in the open in front of everybody. I urge you, Euodia and Syntyche, and they look up, probably at whoever's reading, and go, did he just say our name? And basically Paul is calling them out and saying, you need to knock it off. And when you look at this, the way that Jesus is very straightforward with people and the way that Paul is very straightforward with people, there's actually a lot of dislike towards Paul because of the way that he acts. And some people claim that he's a little bit of a sexist, or that he's just kind of belligerent, but he's not. And the key to that is found in the topic of this evening. It's when Paul says, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And it's phrased a little bit strangely, but to put it in more modern terms, what Paul is saying is, Christ is my life. Christ is my life. That is what I'm all about here. So we're going to look at that, and the question that I want to answer this evening is I want to go down and look at several parts of this letter here to show that Paul is not just saying something flippantly. He's not just throwing it out there, that Christ is my life. You know, sometimes, especially in modern-day America, we have a tendency to do that. We'll throw out something so far-fetched or so amazing as an exaggeration. You know, pizza is my life. And we'll say things like that, but pizza's not really your life. Like the whole reason you are on this earth is not for pizza. You just enjoy it a whole lot. But sadly, it is like that when it comes to Christianity, is we'll tell people, well, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. I'm a follower of Christ. In essence, is what we're saying when we say that we're Christians. But it falls into that same category almost of pizza is my life, is we'll say it, but we're not actually living that out. But when Paul says, to live is Christ. Christ is my life. If I die, it's my gain because I get to go and be with my Lord, with Jesus. And so really the bigger sacrifice for Paul at this point is staying on earth, which is such an incredible thing to think about because of how many of us are totally saturated in this life and we want to stay here. And maybe because I'm a big outdoorsman. I love the outdoors. I think this world is beautiful. I love to fish. I find a lot of joy in this life, despite everything that's been going on in the past couple of years. It's been crazy, but I still love so much about living in this world, and that's okay. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, Solomon, through inspiration, says, enjoy life and enjoy those things that God has given you, and then he places those boundaries, obviously, there. But when Paul says, Christ is my life, he goes on to prove it, and we see that even in the way that he approaches Euodia and Syntyche. So the question we want to answer tonight, though, is how can you know if Christ is your life? How can you know? So this is more like a test. The book of James talks about the Bible and talks about how the Bible is a mirror for us spiritually. So that doesn't just apply, obviously, to the book of James, but to the entire Bible, more specifically the New Testament when it comes to our day-to-day lives and things like that. But when we look at the mirror and we see those flaws and we see those things that we have that we need to fix or change in our life, what do we do with that? And that is a very difficult thing to do. It's a lot easier to sit there and listen to classes and listen to sermons and then start to think like, man, I really hope sister so-and-so heard that because she really needed to hear that. Or you start looking around and go, man, I wish brother and so was here because this lesson was for him. And, you know, we're not really applying these things to ourselves. But he says Christ is our life, and we want to make sure that we have some kind of test to know whether or not Christ is really our life, or if it's just something that we say or we just claim to be Christians like much of America does today. So the first way that you can tell if Christ is your life is if you are able to see the big picture, because Paul could. Paul could see the big picture, even in our verse of tonight, where he says, to live is Christ, to die is gain, in verse 21. He knew. Paul could see the big picture. And I don't have PowerPoint tonight. I actually did. I spent a lot of time making this great PowerPoint, and then I forgot it. So in a last-ditch effort to make up for it, I decided to grab a Sharpie and a piece of printer paper and make just the one PowerPoint I really needed for tonight. So I'm going to show you this. This is probably one of the greatest messages or themes that we see throughout the Bible, and I'll explain it in just a second. So as you look in the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, there is this theme or this message that the Bible is telling us in several different ways. And the message that we get from the entire Bible is that we are living on a pig's nose. That's what this is. This is a pig's nose. Not really. In the PowerPoint, I actually had a picture of a pig. It looked really good. But this represents time, the beginning and ending of time. So this is the oval that you see around the parentheses. It's supposed to be the nostrils of a pig. But the oval that you see around is everything outside. It's eternity. It's the spiritual world. And so the first parentheses here, parenthesi, but the first slash right here is the beginning of time, when God decided to create time in the first place. And so it's really hard to talk about creation because you can't say at this time God decided to create time, because there was no time, and it hurts your head to think about. But God creates time, and then the other end of parentheses here is where God is going to end time. Now, you can look at this and maybe feel some anxiety or a little bit of dread and looking at like, oh, the end is coming. That's not the point I'm trying to make right now, though. I'm actually trying to show some hope in looking at this, because I don't know, especially tonight, because I don't attend here. I don't know all of you by name. I don't know everything that's going on in your life. But one of the greatest reminders that we have in the Bible is that everything that you're going through, whether it's some trial, some sickness, maybe you're dealing with a loss of some kind in your life, all of that takes place within the parentheses. All of that happens right here. But the bigger picture is outside the parentheses. So many times, including myself, we all have moments and times in our lives where we get caught up staring at the pig's nose, and we become obsessed with it. And we think that there are so many things in life that we place emphasis on, or we place more value on, I think, than we should. But we have to realize that we have a limited amount of time. And one day we're going to step off the pig's nose, out of those parentheses, and go into eternity. And Paul gets that. And so he says, for me, right now, my life is Christ. And keep in mind, he's writing this from a Roman cell. He's in prison. And he says a couple different things within that prison that are shocking, coming from someone in his circumstances. First of all, when he's talking to Euodia and Syntyche at the end, we're going to come back to this point in a second, he tells them, rejoice. But not just rejoice, he says rejoice. And again, I say rejoice. And he's talking to two women, and really the church there, and they're free. They're not in prison. And he's saying, rejoice, be happy. Again, I tell you, rejoice. And the reason you have it repeated there, and it's the same reason why he says, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche. You might pronounce those names differently, but those are the names. That's the way I'm going to stick with how I pronounce their names there. But when he said, I urge you twice, and he says rejoice twice, what he's doing is he's placing emphasis on it. In the original Greek, Koine Greek, they didn't have exclamation marks. They didn't have periods. They didn't have question marks or anything like that. So what they would do in order to emphasize, instead of doing all caps or embolden it or changing it to red, yellow, orange, whatever, is they would use words twice in a row. And so I urge Euodia, I urge Syntyche. Basically, please listen to this point. Please listen to what I'm saying to you. This is so important. And then when he says rejoice, again, I say rejoice. Here's the emphasis. This is what's important. Rejoice in the Lord. Christ is my life. Rejoice in that. If you don't, nobody in the world is going to believe you. If you don't, nobody is going to believe you when you say, I'm a Christian, and being a Christian is the greatest thing in the world. And it's like, why? Because y'all seem pretty miserable. And if you think about the world in which they're living, they're claiming to believe in, first of all, one God, and the Romans believed in several different gods. And secondly, they're dealing with Romans who are, old and crusty at this point. And they've lived a whole life serving Caesar and all of these different gods. And when you have some Christians coming along and saying, actually, we serve only one God and all of your gods don't exist, at that point, it's not even premillennialism or anything like that. I mean, they are really picking fights with the community there. How do we know if Christ is our life? Is if we can see the big picture, and Paul could. He knew that, and that's why he's so straightforward with Euodia and Syntyche, is because he's saying, whatever you're bickering about, and notice that Paul never tells them or tells everybody else there in the congregation or tells us as the modern church of today, never tells us what exactly they were arguing about. And there's two reasons I guess he could have done that. One is because we can now apply that to other scenarios in the church today, because people are still people and people will still bicker with one another. And so we can say, hey, look, this is what Paul told Euodia and Syntyche, so whatever you guys are arguing about, you need to work it out pretty much in the same way. The other reason he may not have gone into details about what they were arguing about is because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. In the big picture, in the long run, whatever they're arguing about is not worth it. And so he's trying to get the rest of the church there to see the big picture too, and that's what he's trying to get us to do as well. Is Christ our life? I don't know. Do we think about the big picture, or are we so focused on this life? Are we focused more on our jobs or even on a relationship? You know, codependency is a huge thing. I don't know if it's gotten worse in my generation than maybe some older generations, but codependency within relationships where they're like, I will absolutely die if I don't have my girlfriend, or I'll die if I don't have my boyfriend. And there's this codependency on one another, and there's so much time and energy placed into that, and that's all that matters. It's because you got feelings and emotions wrapped up in that. But it can be anything. Whatever takes the place of Christ, whatever makes you stop thinking about eternity. One, the devil's really, really happy about that. And two, it's a waste of time. And we only have a limited amount of time. And we're told that in several different ways in several different books throughout the Bible here. So how do we know if Christ is our life? Number one, if we can see the big picture. And you can work towards that. And I know that that's something that you have to work towards every day, because I don't want you to look at this as I'm getting up here on my high horse, clippity-clopping around up here saying, like, guys, get off the pig's nose. Stop focusing on this life, because I am human. And it's the same thing happens to me. When I get stressed out, or when things begin, I start to blow things out of proportion and go, this is the biggest deal in the entire world, and I'm caught up doing that. That's what the Bible's for. That's why you keep going back and looking at from Paul's perspective as he's in prison, and he's saying, I'm content and I'm rejoicing. My life is full of joy, even though all of these terrible things are happening, because I know that one day I get to go to heaven and live with Jesus. Okay, how do you know if Christ is your life? If you can see the big picture. Number two, if you have moved beyond talking, if you've moved beyond words, you know, you're walking the walk. You're not just talking the talk. And we'll go into that a little bit deeper here. There's a section of Scripture that I really wrestled with for a long time. And I don't know if you're familiar with this as much, but it's Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62. And I wrestled with this so much that I actually had this passage memorized, and I would just think about it time and time again, because I had this image of Jesus in my mind, and Luke chapter 9 was totally derailing that for me. And it was the way that Jesus answered and dealt with these three individuals that seemed to be very interested in Jesus' ministry. So Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62 says this. They're on the way back from Jerusalem, and a man approaches Jesus and says, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. Now you think about someone who's trying to flip the world upside down, is teaching a message contrary to what these Jewish people have been believing for thousands of years up to this point. And he's turning this upside down, and now all of a sudden you have your first customer, and he runs up to you and says, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus knows that there are about to be two major groups that are going to be pitted against him. You're going to have the Jews that don't like what he's saying as being the Son of God, the coming Messiah, and then looking entirely different than the king riding in on his horse and killing the Romans and freeing the Jews. And then you're going to have the Romans really mad at Jesus for causing these riots or division amongst the people. And so you're about to make two very powerful groups mad at you, and then you have someone come up to you and say, Lord, I'm going to follow you wherever you go, and Jesus completely shuts him down. It says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Not the answer you would expect from someone in the position of Jesus if we're looking at it from a human perspective. Well, right after that, another says, Lord, I'll follow you wherever you go, but first, it's right there. You can look at it if you want. First, allow me to go and bury my father. Now, I've made some pretty lousy excuses in my life. That is a great excuse. Lord, I'm going to follow you, but first, let me go and bury my loved one. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their dead. You be about the kingdom. And especially when I was younger, I had this, actually, it was my first sermon, was out of this section. And I remember I'm 13 or 14 years old, and I'm looking at this going, what do I do with this? I mean, Jesus doesn't seem like he's being a very nice person. His answers are a little bit strange. And then all of a sudden, Christianity seems like it's very difficult, because you're like, Jesus is demanding a whole lot here. And then in some ways it seems to get worse, because the last guy says, Lord, I'll follow you, but first, just let me go back to my house and say goodbye to everybody. Now, that's not a big deal. That's very understandable. If I'm going to change my life, if I'm going to start following you around, joining in on your cause and your mission, then first just let me go say goodbye to everyone. And Jesus says to him, no man after putting his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. And that was so unsettling for me. But the whole point that Jesus is saying is not, if your loved one dies, you can't bury him if you want to follow me, and you can't say goodbye to anybody in your old life if you want to follow me. Jesus is not saying that. His whole message is really wrapped up in what he says to that first person that comes up to him and says, I'll follow you wherever you go. Is Jesus says, do you realize what you just said to me? Do you realize what you're saying? Because foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If you follow me, it's going to mean something that I don't think you fully considered. And that's the main message that Jesus is trying to say. Before you make that leap, before you decide to follow Jesus, count the cost. Count the cost of discipleship. Have we gone beyond the talk? That's how we can know that Christ is our life, is if we've gone beyond, I'm a Christian, and actually start acting like Christians. And again, I don't want this to sound like I'm preaching to everybody here. I'm preaching to myself too, because this is something that we have to work at every day. But there's so many bumper stickers around that have the little fish on the back of their cars, and there's people that they have crosses hanging up in their house, and maybe they have a bobblehead Jesus on their car dashboard, and they're basically in essence saying, like, I will follow you wherever you go. But then Sunday morning rolls around and they decide, okay, what am I going to wear to church? And then they'll go through their closet and they'll put on a tie, and then they'll put on their coat and they'll put on their pants. And basically what they're doing is they're zipping up their Christian costume, and then they're going to go walk into church and they're going to worship. And then Monday they're going to unzip the costume, turn back into whoever they were before, and then go along the week and maybe do the same thing on Wednesday and next Sunday again. So what Jesus is saying is, look, there's more to following me than just saying, I'm going to follow you. And so as we look back at Philippians, we see that in Paul's life, is he is definitely not one that's just going to say, well, I'm going to follow Jesus wherever he goes, unless I'm shipwrecked, unless I'm bitten by a snake, unless I'm thrown into prison, unless I'm starving or I'm thirsty or whatever. If I'm on the brink of death, then I'm going to have to just throw in the towel before that. But we don't see that from Paul. Continually, he's just going through, because Christ has actually become his life. And before we start to think like, man, that is miserable and that sounds horrible, and maybe throw some cold water on being a Christian or trying to live that Christian life, we have to keep in mind that joy that Paul is talking about is very real. So some people have tried to say that the entire book of Philippians, it's the book of joy. But there really is no singular message that Paul has here within this letter. In fact, he even says at one point in the letter that he needs the church there to make his joy complete, because it's not complete yet. What would make his joy complete is if everybody got on board and everyone started living for Christ the way that they needed to. Now, we know that Paul has dealt with some congregations in the past and in his life. Right here, he's reaching the end of his life as he gets to Philippians. He even kind of hints towards to die is gain. What he's saying is, I'm not really sure what God has in mind for me right now. I can see death coming, but if I'm living here, then I'm going to keep on working for Christ. If I die, then that's even better. And this is not some melancholy kind of emo way of looking at life and saying, like, I'm just ready to die. He's not saying that. Christ really is his life. He is happy and finds so much joy in being a Christian, and he wants that same thing for everybody else. So have we moved beyond just talking? There's two snakes in the wild. I'm kind of a dork. I like nature shows, and pretty much everything I watch is some kind of nature commentary. But there's two kinds of snakes, and it cracks me up. But you have a coral snake, which is incredibly deadly, and it's red and black, and it has these red and black stripes that go all the way down the whole snake's body. And then you have the milk snake, which is like the cousin that's not nearly as cool. and it has similar patterns, but it's not deadly at all. I mean, it is completely harmless. And a lot of people have these milk snakes for pets, and I even have some family member that has a coral snake for a pet. But it's a wannabe. It's a wannabe coral snake. It is trying to look as big and as bad as possible. It wants to look just like the coral snake because the coral snake is deadly, and everyone's afraid of the coral snake. But if you know that a milk snake is just a milk snake and not a coral snake, unless you are just terrified of snakes, it's understandable. It's completely harmless. It's just pretending to be something that it's not. Something even more strange. I don't know if you've heard of the peanut bug, or maybe it's the alligator head bug. There's a couple different terms for it. But it's this insect that has several different superpowers. And what it does is if there is a hawk or an eagle or a falcon or an owl that is swooping down and is about to eat it, it can leap from the branch, and then it will spread its wings out, these moth-like wings, and on the back of its wings there are these two bright yellow eyes, and it looks just like the face of an owl. And you can look at pictures of it, and it's pretty cool. But the wings look just like the face of an owl, but obviously it's an insect, and it's not an owl. We know that, and we can tell that it clearly is an insect. But what Paul is trying to do is get people to move past just saying that they're Christians, or just get past just going to services and pretending to be something that they're not. He's trying to get us to make Christ our life, and it is an ongoing thing. I'll probably repeat that a few more times as we go through here. Okay, so how do you know if Christ is your life? Number one, if you can see the big picture. Number two, if you're moving beyond just talking and you are actually putting those things into action. And number three, I think it's number three, you can know that Christ is your life if you're content. Now, contentment is something that I think is a little bit misunderstood, maybe just because of the English translation of contentment. But you see Paul begins to talk about that in Philippians chapter 4. As he gets towards the end, he says, I've learned to be content in all things. And again, I'd like to point out here that he is in prison when he's writing this, and he says that I've learned to be content in everything. And really there's a couple ways that you can translate that original word and pull out the meaning behind what he means by contentment, because we might be looking at this and go, man, my circumstances in life right now are not nearly as bad as what Paul's were, and I'm really struggling with contentment. I'm not just happy with how things are. Well, that's not really the idea that Paul is trying to get across here when he says, I've learned to be content in all things. It's the same thing when Paul says to have joy or to rejoice. He's not saying be happy all the time, no matter what horrible things are going on in your life, because happiness is a feeling, and the way that we talk about contentment is a feeling. I don't feel good when things are going bad, so obviously I must not be a very good Christian, and maybe that's because of a misunderstanding that are attached to both of these words. But contentment means unchanged regardless of outside circumstances. That's all that means. That your belief does not shake no matter what circumstances that you find yourself in. So anyone can be content anytime about anything, and it's this supernatural and spiritual change that God has on those faithful Christians as they begin to make Christ more their life. The more content they are because they can see the world clearly. When the Bible uses the word wisdom, it's not this magical knowledge that will come into our heads and make us like some kind of wizard or something like that. When the Bible talks about wisdom, what the Bible is saying is that we have learned to now look at the world the way that God looks at the world. So when Paul says, I've learned to be content in all things, it's because, well, Christ is his life. And because Christ is God, Paul is able to look at the world around him, look at the circumstances that he finds himself in, and see them through the eyes of God. This is just temporary. The world that we're in right now, we're just on the pig's nose. We're just in between those parentheses right now. All of my problems, this stint in prison, we're talking about this thousands of years later. He had his time on earth. It was relatively brief in the grand scheme of things, and it's over, and it's done. And it's then when we can really see how blessed we are as Christians to think that, man, for this small little amount of time that we have to face these trials and these hardships in this life, we have literally eternity, infinity, and beyond of no more sorrow, no more hurt, no more pain. And so now we kind of picture where Paul is coming from. If I die, it's my gain. That is my profit if I die. And he has been dead for a long time. His physical body has, but he's been enjoying that paradise since he passed on all the way to this day. And then as more Christians either pass away or God comes and the judgment day comes and his church is welcomed home, and all of us will join him and all of those that made Christ their life as well. But back when we get to contentment here, it is a recognized and willful dependence on God. That's contentment. That's what contentment is, and it's something that can and must be learned. Because contentment is something that is going to keep our heads on straight when things start getting bad, when things start getting rough. Contentment is a very big problem in the church today because there are so many things that we can pick out and find that we're not content about, even when it comes to congregations. And I don't know if that's what those two women were arguing about. They weren't content about something that was going on, or the way that someone was treating them, or maybe their preacher or their song leader, or they sing the same ones people can pick out anything that they want that makes them not content. And the danger with it, and Paul knows this, is that it's contagious. Have you ever been in a circle, everything, the mood is great, and then someone starts complaining about something, and it just spreads like wildfire around. They just go, yeah, oh man, that person just gets under my skin so much, so annoying. In fact, 2 weeks ago, guess what he posted on Instagram? Guess what? Guess what they did to me? Guess what they said? And then they go and on and on and on, and then people begin to get mad. And it's the same thing on social media or on the news today. When we become uncontent with how things are, it can spread and it can completely change church dynamics or group dynamics, especially in a congregation. So what Paul is saying to these Philippians is, right now you're in a tough spot, Caesarea Philippi, surrounded by all these pagan idols and everything. But if you start letting that discontent fill your hearts and fill the church there, it's just going to be a horrible existence on this earth. And so that's why he says rejoice. And again, I say rejoice. Now, that's very interesting to me. When I went to go visit my family over the weekend, I got to go to the Connect conference. I don't know if anyone here was there or was able to go or even know what I'm talking about. But it's this conference that happened in Nashville, Tennessee, and it was just called Connect, and the whole series was on evangelism. And afterwards, I got to go stay with my parents for a little bit. And so my dad, Neil, began to pray, and he said in his prayer, I don't know if it was an accident or what, but he said, as he was praying, he said, please help us to enjoy our time together. And it was as he's praying for the food. And so afterwards, I was like, you had to ask, for some supernatural help for us to have a good time. Is it that bad? Did we not want to have this family time that bad? But that obviously wasn't what he was saying. But when we look at the command here, it is almost comical as he says, rejoice. And again, I say rejoice because there's a whole lot of commands in the Bible that you have, but you don't have all of them repeated. For instance, murder. We don't have the command in the Bible, do not murder. And again, I say, don't murder. Because that's not something that everybody struggles with. We're not like, man, I just have this huge problem of killing people, and I hate that Paul has now given me this command not to kill anybody because it's really difficult to do. But when it comes to rejoicing, Paul has to say, rejoice, be joyful. And again, I say, be joyful. Have joy in your life. And the main reason is because that is how people can know that we're Christians and because we have so much to be joyful about. Now, I want you to think about, if you've had a speeding ticket before, then maybe this just lands a little bit too close to home here. But if you're a parent, I want you to imagine that your kid just got pulled over by the police officers going 105 down Memorial Parkway. This is a big ordeal, and so he's already been through a lot because, the red and blue lights were flashing in his mirror and his heart's pumping, and he's, just super worked up because he hasn't been pulled over before, and this first time is going to be a doozy. And so the cop comes around to the window and says, I can't let you off. You're going 105. Here's your ticket, and gives him a ticket. And so the son is going home, and he knows that he was driving his parents' car, and then now he's going to have to go into the real hardship. And it's not the police officer. It's going home and now facing his parents. And so the kid opens up the door, and he walks into the house, and he sees his parents are already standing in the living room as soon as he walks in. And so he's like, and he's thinking about all the things he's going to be grounded from, or maybe, cast into the dungeon or whatever parents do to their kids in those kinds of situations. And so his dad says, come upstairs with me, I need to talk to you. And so he goes upstairs, and he's fully expecting his dad, as he's walking up the stairs, to be pulling off that belt, and just getting ready to lay into him. But instead, he sits on the bed, and he tells his son to sit on the bed next to him, and he does. And he says, I've done a lot of bad things in my life. I've messed up a whole lot, and God showed me mercy. And even now, I'm trying to live for Christ the best that I can, and as I go along, sometimes I still make mistakes, and I still slip up, and so God shows me grace. And because of that grace, I can go on, and I can keep on walking in the light. And so, because God has done this for me this one time, not in every situation, but this one time, I'm going to show you mercy. I'm going to pay this ticket for you, and you're not going to have to worry about it. So the kid, he's over the moon, overjoyed. And so the next day, he goes to school. And the whole time he's at school, he's bragging to all of his friends and saying, you will have no idea what my dad just did last night. You know how I got that speeding ticket going 105? Well, I thought my parents were going to kill me. And I got home, and I told them about it, and my dad showed me mercy. He's not going to hold that against me, and he's even paying the ticket for me. And so all of his friends start saying things like, man, I wish my parents were like that. Man, I wish my dad would do things like that. It's like my parents would never have done anything like that in that kind of situation. So the kid comes back home, and he starts telling his dad, Dad, guess what everyone at school is saying? They want to be a part of this family, and he's, all proud of that. And so the dad starts feeling pretty good about it. He's like, that's right. Yeah, this is a great family. Everyone should want to be a part of this family. And it's spread all over the place because of what was done for the kid. Now, we take that and that put it on a completely different level when we're talking about Christianity and what Christ has done for us. But when Paul is pleading, and he really is pleading when using those two words in a row, rejoice, and again I say rejoice, when he's pleading with them to be joyful, is because he's telling them, look, we have so much to be thankful for, and we have so much to be happy about and to have joy in our life. And so what he's trying to tell them is, so why don't you go out and tell your community there at Caesarea Philippi and confront all of these retired Roman soldiers and all those that believe in pagan gods, and show them the joy that you have, and show that passion that you have for being a Christian and making Christ your life, because it's contagious and it makes everybody think, just like that kid's friends did. It will make everybody think, I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that family because of what our Father has done for us. It works the same way. But when we sing sometimes, and this where we're trying to make it very practical, I don't want to just read scriptures and just kind of leave it hanging there. Making it practical. When we sing, I don't know if you've ever looked around before. There was this congregation I used to preach for on weekends, and they had this table, and it was set up, and it was like a giant rectangle. And we would sit around there, and so when we'd sing, we'd look at each other when we sang. And it was very strange because I wasn't used to that environment growing up. I was used to, the classic layout of pews and all that. But you're staring at each other while you're singing. And some people are trying not to make eye contact. But there are some people that are they're smiling. And I remember this one older lady who was sitting directly across from me, and we were singing, and the whole time she's smiling and she's looking right at me. And I could not, for the life of me, make eye contact. I thought it was so strange. And then in the car on the way home, I'm beating myself up. I'm like, you know what? I probably made her feel horrible because she was one of the few people in that room that was smiling when she was singing, and I couldn't even make eye contact with her, and I probably made her feel bad for smiling at me. And I started thinking about that more and more. And then as you look around in the churches today, that there might be some happiness there, but sometimes we just don't show it, and we don't look like we're happy when we're singing, and we do have so much to be joyful about. And so you have Paul coming in and basically writing this letter to the entire church saying, look, have some joy in their circumstances. And I know that we live in a time that's a lot better than what they were going through, but we still do have so much to be thankful for and so much to have joy about. Is Christ our life? How can we know if Christ is our life? We can know that Christ is our life if we can see the big picture, if on a day-to-day basis, if eternity is constantly on our minds, because it should be. Eternity that's what's going to last the longest. And that might be the biggest understatement ever, but eternity is a long, long time. And everybody in this room is going to live forever. So 100 years from now, everybody in here is going to be alive. 200 years from now, everybody in this room is going to be alive. 3,000 years from now, everybody's going to be alive somewhere. And that's the message that we have in the Bible. It always goes in twos. When you get in Proverbs, you have the wise man, you have the foolish man. You get to the New Testament, you have the sinful and you have the faithful. When you get to the end of life, you have where the faithful go and where the sinful go. Where are we going to go? I mean, eternity is the big picture. It should be something that's on our minds. And if it's constantly on our mind and we're thinking about that day when either Jesus comes back and takes us home, or that day when we die, what are we doing with the time that we have on the pig's nose, within the parentheses? What are we doing with that time? We can know Christ is our life if we're constantly thinking about that and how we can make the most of those opportunities. And if we go beyond the talking, we're not just saying we're Christians, but we're acting on those things. And if we're content with how things are in our life because of what Christ has done for us. He's done way more than we deserve, and we only have to be content for a little while. We only have to suffer for a little while in some instances. And if we're joyful, if we're showing joy because of what we have in Christ, that's how we can know if Christ is our life. And when we die, we can say just like Paul, when we die, we have everything to gain. We have everything to profit from when we go. But that also only happens if we are a part of the church. And tonight, by way of invitation, I would like to, if you've been thinking about this for a while, I've probably been in your shoes before because I was the one that stayed awake at night and laid in my bed constantly thinking about, man, I know I need to do this, I know I need to do this. And Sunday after Sunday would roll by because I didn't want to have to walk down front and sit on a pew in front of a bunch of people and be baptized in front of everybody. I didn't want to do it. But you don't have to do that. You could wait. You could tell somebody and wait for everybody to go home and leave. And then you could put on Christ in baptism, and it works exactly the same, no matter how many people are in the room. If you are thinking about it, and for whatever reason something's been holding you back, I'd like to encourage you tonight to do it. It's the best decision you'll ever make. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything in order to be a Christian, but you can know enough. If you know that Christ came to this world and that he died and that he rose from the grave and that he can wash away your sins, then you know enough to be baptized. I hope you do count the cost and know that it's more than just saying that you're going to follow Jesus, but that you are going to live your life for him. But if you slip up, if you fall down afterwards, don't worry about it. There's grace, and grace covers you. And if you're trying to walk in the light as he is in the light, you have fellowship with one another. If there's something that's keeping you from being that faithful Christian or being that faithful servant, and you want to make that commitment to God, that recommitment to God, then you can do that as well tonight. If you're struggling with something, if you're discouraged, if the world's kind of beating you up, that's what we're here for. The church is a tool that God has given us to help each other keep on rejoicing when we don't feel that great, to help each other when those times when we don't feel content or when we don't feel like Christ is really our life. That's what the church is for. I hope you have some good godly friends and some good brothers and sisters to lean on from the people I've met. Seems like you do. But that's what the church is for. So tonight, before you go home, if there's something that you need to take care of that falls into that spiritual realm, I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and take care of that together as we stand and as we sing.
Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you reap all of victory when there's wonderful power in the blood? There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus the King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Thank you, Dale, for that wonderful lesson. Jesus is our life. I don't know about you, but I'll never look at a pig's snout the same way again. Are there any other announcements that we need to make this evening? Steve?
Remember Mark, he had surgery on his foot yesterday. He's gonna be laid up about 2 weeks. We'll just remember him for prayer.
Okay. Anything else?
Dale, pray for, Morgan, Lane's wife. She lost her grandmother. Pray for her grandmother.
Okay. Anything else? 713. 713. Let's sing the first verse of this song, and then Steve Gullion will dismiss us in prayer. 713. How sweet